In other videos, I've talked about detection techniques that IPSs might use, and they include things like signature-based or rule-based detection, as well as anomaly-based detection. And now I want to talk about a third mechanism for being able to detect intrusions in an enterprise setting, or really in any setting where you have a network, and that's something called stateful protocol analysis. And let me kind of dissect what this means. So there's obviously two concepts here. The concept of protocol analysis is where you would essentially kind of profile the protocol's behaviors, or profile the protocol's behavior. And by protocol, I mean things like FTP or HTTP or something of that nature. So an actual network protocol. You would profile its behavior, come up with some type of model that encapsulates that protocol, and then look for deviations. So you might flag deviations to kind of proper protocol behavior. And by proper, I mean, and really, what this refers to is the idea of looking at things like what are the actual standards, what are the specifications of the protocol according to the official standards, and also looking at things around, what are the typical practices when you see a protocol of this nature. Maybe certain things are never really seen in practice at all, even though they might be allowed by the standard. And if you do see something like that in actual practice, that might in and of itself be suspicious. So for example, maybe to be more specific, you can imagine that maybe some protocols might have commands that get passed through. Those commands might have arguments, and maybe the arguments in practice typically have certain size ranges. So if you see an argument that's maybe too big passed as part of a command, that would be suspicious in and of itself. And oftentimes actually exploits happen that way, where somebody will try to send essentially binary contents within an argument and trick the receiving system into actually executing those binary contents. And so obviously binary contents tend to be much larger than maybe a typical command might be, and so you would notice something potentially very suspicious in that case. Now the other aspect of this is the notion of statefulness. Okay, so statefulness, and this really just means that when you do the protocol analysis, you would actually track the state of the protocol. And I'll first kind of describe this at a high level, then I'll give a specific example, which I think would be very helpful. So imagine, just in general, when you think about the way protocols work, is you have, let's say, two systems, and they're going to be communicating with each other, and really the way it works is they basically send messages back and forth. So system 1 sends message M1 to system 2, and this one replies back with M2, and this might reply back with M3, and so on. Okay, and the protocol, these might be part of the protocol. So for example, if you're talking about TCP, you might do a SYN ACK and then a SYN ACK and so on and so forth. Okay, and really each time messages are sent back and forth on each of these systems, you can think of there being kind of a state that has to be maintained. So obviously when M1 is received by the system, he might maintain state S1, and then he'll have to maintain that state so that when he sees message M3 later on, and he knows it's associated with this one protocol flow, he might combine that with the current state to figure out what the next state should be. Okay, and really what you want to do when you talk about stateful protocol analysis is really account for not just the messages themselves, but also the different states. And you may also want to account for the actual flow, not just looking at a single message being passed from one party to another, but the actual flow of messages being passed back and forth. Okay, so let me actually give a bit of an example. I think it might help to kind of illustrate the point. So the example I'll give has to do with the FTP protocol, and this is kind of a canonical example of stateful protocol analysis. So in the FTP protocol, you can have multiple states, but one of the most common states when you first kind of start is what's called being unauthenticated. So at this point, you are, and FTP stands for the File Transfer Protocol, and it's really a protocol by which you can retrieve and even transmit files between resources on a network, between different systems on a network. And obviously when you first start, you haven't provided any credentials yet, and so you're going to be unauthenticated. And when you're unauthenticated, you can still run certain commands. For example, you can run help, or maybe you can run commands to log in. And by that would include things like your username and password. So you can provide those in a command as well to kind of keep yourself, or to get yourself eventually authenticated. But really when you're in the authenticated state, there's not a heck of a lot you can do. You have a limited number of options. Okay, now imagine you have actually provided a username and password. Well, in that case, you're going to now change states, and you're going to go from being unauthenticated to being authenticated. So you went from being unauthenticated to being actually authenticated. And when you are authenticated, Now you may be allowed to do a lot more stuff, like maybe in an authenticated state, you can go ahead and retrieve files, and you may have many, many, many more commands that you can run at your disposal. So one way you can apply stateful protocol analysis to FTP is if you see somebody, for example, doing things when they're unauthenticated that you typically would only do when you were authenticated. That would be a big red flag. Like if there are certain commands that this guy is trying to run, and he's still unauthenticated, and these are typically commands that are only allowed by authenticated users, then you know something might be awry with that particular user. Okay? You can also look for things like maybe repeat commands, or just commands that are used in some strange fashion. So maybe you see somebody repeatedly, entering the same command over and over again, or maybe entering commands that that don't normally get executed or don't normally get issued unless you've executed other commands prior to that point. So maybe you can look for out of order commands, and that's again a sign that something is the protocol is not being used kind of in a legitimate fashion, but is possibly being used by some type of an intruder who is trying to to get your data somehow. Okay, so I want to close really briefly by talking about some challenges of this approach. What are some challenges of state-based or stateful protocol analysis? And so I think the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges at least, is performance. I mean, the reality is that it is not cheap to maintain so much state, and so performance definitely takes a hit. You have to keep track of state at the protocol level, be able to track messages back and forth, and that definitely has its own set of issues. I think the other issue is around really the fact that you may have a particular standard for a protocol, but there may be deviations in the actual implementation of the protocol. So maybe different vendors might implement the same protocol in different ways, and that's actually a concern, because oftentimes when you look at standards documents, and let me actually get that right, so deviations in the implementation, and when you often look at standards documents, sometimes they don't specify things very carefully, or they may leave something subject to interpretation, and that's a case in which you may see a deviation in implementation. Okay, and then the final thing is that you may also have proprietary implementation, and that's actually very important to keep in mind. So proprietary implementations. Okay, this is where maybe a vendor will decide that they want to implement something a bit differently than what the standard specifies, and if you do run into that situation, you may see something that looks inappropriate or incorrect. It might in fact be legitimate traffic, and so these are all, ultimately these last two can lead to things like false positives, because you don't have a good view of what the protocol is actually supposed to be doing. There may be situations in which it is legitimately behaving in a way that's different from your understanding or your model of that particular protocol. Okay, so I think that's pretty much all I want to say about stateful protocol analysis. Hopefully this gave you an idea of how it works, at least at a high level, and I look forward to making some more videos. Thanks a lot.